Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Geneva Press Club today. You can follow us on www.pressclub.ch, where we are live streaming this session. And welcome also to those who follow us on Zoom. And we will also have speakers that intervene on Zoom. We are going to talk about Yemen today, and especially we are going to show a documentary film made and prepared by the Southern Independent Group of Yemen. And the discussion, we will have a discussion with Nasr Obaid. You are a human rights activist of the Southern Independent Group, and beside of you there is Saleh Al-Noud. Saleh Al-Noud is a lawyer practicing international law, specialized in criminal immigration and human rights law in Sheffield in UK. So welcome to everybody, and I'll give right away the floor to Nasr Obaid. The floor is yours, Mr. Obaid.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to our events, Lethal Force. Lethal Force is the title of the documentary film prepared by the Southern Independent Group. Lethal Force talks about unlawful violence against the civilians in Yemen by the government. The film follows many cases in which state apparatus uses excessive violence, including suppression of peaceful protest, such as continuing violation against the right to suppression assembly in Shabwa. The film also highlights the phenomenon of the assassination of members of the Shabwani Elite Forces. Eyewitnesses testimony, in addition to the testimony of the victims and their families, clearly point the finger at the government forces being behind these practices, supported by extremist and terrorist groups and operatives based in government-controlled area. Before we start the movie, I would like to share with you some information, short information about Shabwa. Shabwa consists of 17 districts distributed over an area of over 40,000 square kilometers. Since the beginning of 2015, some of these districts have witnessed armed confrontation between the fighters of Ansarullah, armed group of Houthis, and their former ally, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, on one hand, and the fighters of the resistance group, mainly they are from the south, supported by the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, on the other hand. During the presence of Ansarullah group Houthis in Shabwa, the group was responsible for a huge number of violations. It carried out arbitrary arrest of civilians and recruitment of children, as well as planting mines before its withdrawal. The Bihan and Osailan districts were the last strongholds of Ansarullah Houthis after their withdrawal in August 2015 from Attack, the governorate center, and As-Sa'id and Al-Miswana districts. Following the fighting between Ansarullah and the resistance force from the mid-December 2017 until early January 2018, Shabwa was completely under the control of the pro-Hadi forces, and the UAE, Emirates, backed Shabwani elite fighters. The Shabwani elite and army units loyal to President Hadi have taken control of Shabwa since January 2018, where in this period the human rights the human rights violations in the government have decreased, with noticeable improvement in the security and the humanitarian aspects. Unfortunately, as a result of political tension within the legitimate government militia of Islah, the local branch of Muslim Brotherhood has attacked Shabwa and took control of it totally, partially in some area in Shabwa, or we can say totally. Mainly they are coming from north of Yemen, specifically from Ma'rib Governorate. Since the Brotherhood militia set a foot in Shabwa in August 2019, this group has committed the most heinous crimes against humanity in the governorate, including violations, killing, kidnapping, and an arbitrary arrest outside the framework of the law against the people of the governorate who reject the militia presence in it. This crime and practices carried out by the Brotherhood militia do not stop at Shabwa and its residents only, but also affected travelers and passers-by from other southern governorates with flimsy pretext and slogans, for they have no sin except that they are southern of passion and identity and support the Southern Transitional Council. Not only that, but the treachery of the Brotherhood has targeted and extended to the Sheikh and tribes of Shabwa who are refusing to the Brotherhood militia with military combines and terrorist practices. All these practices and violations come in order to silence the mouth of honorable and free people of Shabwa who reject presence of Brotherhood militia on their pure land. Unfortunately, also last week, the Houthi militia intensified their military operation against Shabwa districts, and last week or last 3 days, they controlled some area in Shabwa like Bayhan and Usaylan. So this is the summary of information about Shabwa. Now we will start the movie. Please.
In 2009, a Human Rights Watch report stated that a severe human rights crisis was unfolding in southern Yemen, as government security forces responded to calls for secession with a violent crackdown on the southern movement. The report indicated that tensions between the South and the North might form a violent confrontation between the two parties. The organization's researcher, Christoph Wilke, emphasized that the demands for secession are an opinion and that the violence is an infringement. Within 2 years of the Human Rights Organization's report, the so-called Yemeni Youth Revolution took off. On the 18th of March 2011, an armed attack against Sanaa''s protesters killed at least 45 demonstrators. That day was dubbed Friday of Dignity. Still, Human Rights Watch described it as a Friday of no dignity and described the investigation which was conducted concerning it as tainted by defects and political interference from beginning to end. The former Yemeni president, Ali Saleh, has long been known for his military style of governing Yemen. However, did the fall of the Saleh regime mean an end to violence against civilians? Is the new country able to fulfill its most important duties, protecting citizens and ensuring their freedoms, or as if nothing happened? This clip was filmed in Shabwa, southern Yemen. It documents the killing of a civilian named Saeed Tajera al-Qurmish during a peaceful demonstration in 2019. Saeed was shot by a member of the internationally recognized legitimate government. Saeed was not armed, nor under any circumstance that justified the use of force against him. For example, whether he posed a threat of imminent death or serious injury to anyone. Reports by the human rights organizations, press reports, and citizens have documented many similar cases of the use of lethal force against unarmed civilians across the country.
Well, if the protest is peaceful, then it should be allowed to go forward. I mean, this is the important thing. And if you're trying to build a more open, more democratic society, the right of the people to meet, to speak, to protest should be guaranteed. So the answer to your question is, as long as the protesters remain peaceful, they have the right to protest, and the government should not interfere with that. Government has the responsibility to maintain law and order. They have the responsibility to ensure that protests don't become violent, that protesters don't interfere with the rights of other citizens. But as long as those elements are guaranteed, are agreed to, then the right of the people to protest is important and should be protected.
The authorities responsible for using violence against citizens may seem clear before the fall of the Saleh regime, but this is not precisely the case. According to the Human Rights Watch reports, since before the Youth Revolution, the state has used its loyal militias to suppress protests in southern Yemen. The members of those militias were armed men wearing civilian clothes. In such a case, it is difficult to know who is responsible for the violence. During the Youth Revolution in 2011, armed men wearing civilian clothes in Sana'a launched the deadliest attack on protesters on Friday of Dignity.
One of the reasons that the situation deteriorated in 2013 and 2014 is because the average citizen didn't feel safe. There were attacks, there was terrorism, there was problems with food and fuel that were interrupted by these different elements. And all of those things took away from the confidence that people should have had in the government to look after their basic needs. So one of the things as we hopefully come out of this conflict and begin to try to restore order in the country is to look after these issues and make sure that the government is strong enough and has all of the ability to provide security for the people.
The increase in conflict and insecurity led to the Houthi rebels taking control of large parts of the country's north, while al-Qaeda managed to spread and control other areas to the south. While most of the north is still under the Houthis' control, who practice various violations against the population, the terrorist elements of the al-Qaeda have been expelled from the southern parts thanks to the elite forces and the security belt. Although the legitimate government claims to extend its control and govern in the liberated areas, insecurity and repression, killings and assassinations, and impunity continue to haunt citizens in many areas, such as the Hadramaut Valley and Shabwa. Shabwa Governorate represents a unique case study of insecurity and repression in the liberated areas. Since before the Yemeni crisis, Shabwa has significantly suffered from insecurity, partly because of the tribal and vengeful nature. However, Shabwa witnessed a remarkable calm after the Shabwani Elite Forces entered the governorate in 2017, and the imposition of security, including the expulsion of terrorist elements.
2016 أو 2017 قبل نزول النخبة الشبوانية إلى محافظة شبوة كانت أوضاع مزرية أسوة بكل مناطق الجنوب. بعد دخول النخبة الشبوانية في 2016 و17 وصلت إلى معظم مديريات محافظة شبوة، وعلى رأس المركز المحافظة شبوة عاصمة المحافظة عتق كانت تسود المنطقة أو المحافظة أمناً واستقراراً، بعيداً عن تلك السنوات العجاف التي مرت على شبوة من الثارات القبلية ومن الفتن ومن كل المقومات الحياة على مستوى المحافظة.
In 2018, a study on the security situation in Shabwa by the Dar al-Ma'arif Foundation for Research and Statistics showed that more than 71% of the study sample felt the security situation stability in the area controlled by the elite forces. The majority of them confirmed the disappearance of carrying weapons in public places, and more than 66% feel that the assassinations phenomena is over. However, the Shabwani Elite Forces withdrew from Shabwa in August 2020, which returned the province to a worse situation than it was.
وبعد طبعا انسحاب قوات النخبة الشبوانية ويعني سيطرة القوات الموالية لحكومة الشرعية، للأسف عادت الأوضاع يعني أكثر سوء إلى محافظة شبوة. هناك تقارير تصلنا شبه يومية إلى يعني قتل، إصابات، اعتقالات تعسفية، مهاجمة يعني مدن كجردان ونصاب في لقموش وحبان في بالمدافع، وضرب البيوت وإخافة الناس، إرعابهم. كل هذه الأعمال من أجل اعتقال، يعني من أجل أن يقوم باعتقالات، من أجل ترويع الأهالي. ليس في هذا حسب، بل أنه أيضا كمان تم قمع المظاهرات السلمية التي خرج من أجلها أبناء محافظة شبوة بدعوة من منظمات المجتمع المدني لرفض هذا التواجد، لرفض هذه الأعمال. أيضا هذه المظاهرات قوبلت بالقمع وقوبلت بالرصاص الحي. كانت أول مظاهرة في عزان سقط فيها الشهيد سعيد تاجرة، وأيضا أصيب مواطنين. وفي المظاهرة الأخرى في المصينعة كمان تم اعتقال 85 يعني معتقل بين أطفال وكبار سن، وتم يعني الزج بهم إلى سجون سرية. البعض يعني بقى لأيام دون أن يستطيع التواصل مع أهله، والبعض يعني عانى من مشاكل صحية.
After the Shabwani Elite Forces' departure, the Frontline Organization for Human Rights documented 55 cases of killing and injury in the governorate and more than 600 victims of arbitrary arrests, including activists, soldiers, and citizens within a year and a few months, not to mention theft and looting of private and public property, including former Elite Forces camps. Salih Aqil bin Rashid, a social figure from Shabwa, tells us one of the many examples of the use of violence against civilians after the departure of the Shabwani Elite Forces.
بالنسبة لما حصل في قرانا بأنهم جاءوا الفجر تمام إلا ويداهموا ينتشرون في على مستوى قرية بحر الرام، والناس ليش ايش فيها ايش معاكم ايش السبب لهذا الكلام؟ يقولوا نحن نبحث عن مطلوبين لايش؟ عملوا ايش؟ اتكلموا نحن اهلهم يقولوا لنا بنجيبهم نحن اللي عندكم يا جماعه، ليش ترهبون الناس؟ ليش ترهبون الاطفال بلادكم باطلاق النار؟ هكذا بالطريق المهم انه استوى الاشتباك فيما بين ابناء المنطقه تمام وبين القوه هذا تمام. شفت اللي تريد ان ضربوا بالمدفعيه حقهم وضربوا بالعيارات الثقيله، يعني استخدموا كل انواع الاسلحه مدفعيه وكل شيء، فجروا بيوت الناس، هدوا بيوت الناس.
In September 2020, unknown assailants killed Rami Rashid, a relative of Saleh bin Rashid, working with the Shabwani Elite Forces. Rami was killed while he was out shopping in the daytime, unarmed in his civilian clothes.
في اليوم اللي قتل فيه كان يريد أن يقلب تمام، استلم الراتب حقه ويشتي يجيب حليب لابنه، لأنه كان في الورقة الطلبات اللي حق الأولاد كانت في جيبه لما قتل، يشتي يجيب حليب يعني مستلزمات الطفل هذا ومستلزمات الأسرة. وبعد ما خرج من مكان الصرافة تمام بمسافة صرافة الجنيدي بمسافة حوالي 100 متر وعلى بعد أقل من 50 متر من الطقم العسكري، لاقوه قوى الإرهاب بسيارة هايلوكس واستغفلوه على قفله وقتلوه بدم بارد. ويصلوا بنا لقيناهم جابوه لنا لعزان، الولد منتهي.
Rami left behind a 2-year-old boy who was waiting him to return. Bendar bin Hyohar, another victim from the elite forces who was not killed on the battlefields, he was killed unarmed and in ordinary clothing by unknown persons.
بعد التزامه بمنع حمل السلاح ذهب كعادته كأي مواطن، يعني يذهب إلى منطقة عزان يتسوق وكل يوم يذهب، يعني وراح إلى عزان وهو عايد من عزان كأن شيء يعني حصل له في عزان أو رأى شيء أو المهم الذين يعني نقلوا لنا الأخبار يقولون أنه انطلق من عزان مسرع. أيوة ما كان من عوايده، وفي عزان كانت شبكة تكون ضعيفة، كانت شبكة يعني ضعيفة، شبكة الاتصالات من عزان إلى الحوض شبكة الاتصالات، ولعله شيء لاحظ شيء في عزان أو حد نبهه أو حد هدده فانطلق مسرع ومر في طريق الخرمة، سمى الخرمة، وخلاص داخل في حدود الحوضة، يعني دخل الغيل داخل في حدود الحوضة، بيدخل في منطقة اسمها العزيفة بين جبلين. في هذيك المنطقة يعني سيارة هيلوكس فيها يقال انهم 4 نفر وبعضهم يقولون 5 نفر، يعني ملثمين كلهم، فضربوه وهو على يعني دراجته النارية. أصيب بطلقات هنا في جنبه، طلقتين، وطلقة في اليد هنا وطلقة في كتفه. أسقطوه من على دراجته، ومن ثم نزلوا وتمموا عليه، وكلها الضرب في هذا المكان. يعني لا هي 5 ولا 10 ولا 15، يعني أكثر من 28 رصاصة يعني في هذا المكان.
Relatives of the victims and residents hold the legitimate government authorities responsible for protecting them, a view that many militaries and human rights experts agree to.
اللي يحكم، الحاكم الفعلي هو الذي يتحمل. الحاكم الفعلي هو الذي يتحمل. نعم، لأن هؤلاء يعتبرون رعية بغض النظر عن عمله أو أنه من الجهة التي كان يعمل فيها. أصبح الآن من بعد خروج النخبة في شيء يعني يهدد حياته، كان المفروض يعني يتخذون إجراءات، لكن للأسف الشديد قتل الأول ثم الثاني ثم الثالث ثم تلاهم الرابع، والأمور صارت.
نحن بحكم وجودنا في المحافظة ونعرف يعني كل شاردة وواردة يتحمل المسؤولية الأساسية والجنائية والقضائية والإنسانية والأخلاقية فيما تتعرض له شبوة وأبناء شبوة. نحن لا نتحملها إلا محافظ المحافظة وقائد المحور العسكري وقائد الشرطة في المحافظة. هؤلاء هم الثلاثة مسؤولين على كل شاردة وواردة، كانت سلبا أو إيجابا، ولكن إيجابا هذا مش موجود في قاموس شبوة، وإنما كل سلب موجود: القتل، الاختطاف، التعذيب، حتى الموت في الكنتيرات، الانتهاكات، النهب والسلب لمقدرات المحافظة وتقاسمها، وهي الآن بلا كهرباء وبلا غاز منزلي وبلا أيضا محروقات.
So, a government, the fundamental responsibility of government is to ensure that there's a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Now, as you know, the Yemeni state has never been particularly strong outside of Sana'a and Aden. So, it gets harder the harder away you get from the capital. But, whoever claims to govern, that is a function of governance. But historically, in the provinces of Yemen, government has always been weak.
إذا تحدثنا عن شبوة، طبعا هناك سلطات ثلاث اللي هي السلطة المحلية والأمنية والعسكرية. طبعا بعد انسحاب قوات النخبة الشبوانية، هذه السلطات الثلاث هي من تتحمل المسؤولية الكاملة عن الانفلات الأمني الحاصل هناك. السلطات الثلاث قامت بإقصاء كل من يعني كان ينتمي للنخبة الشبوانية، وتم استبدالهم استبدالهم بناس مدنيين والمعلمين وأئمة مساجد ليقوموا ب أخذ مناصب أمنية وعسكرية. فطبيعي أن يكون هذا إخفاق موجود، لأن الموضوع أصبح مسيس، أصبح فقط من يوالي من هو الذي ممكن أن يأخذ هذه المناصب العسكرية والأمنية في محافظة شبوة.
The government has the responsibility. There's no question that under a normal situation, the government is responsible for providing security, for providing law and order to the citizens. But we're in this situation now, the situation of civil conflict, where the ability of the government to fulfill its responsibilities simply isn't there. And the reason that they can't is because of all of these different elements, the presence of these factions, of these other elements, some of them supported by the outside powers, some of them trained and equipped by outside powers that have taken away from the ability of the government to really meet the demand of the people for security.
The former U.S. ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Firestein, believes that the presence of several armed groups in the liberated areas in general makes the one responsible for security of the citizens unclear. Still, he wonders about the role of the tribe, which has always played an essential role in the Yemeni society's life.
Unfortunately, the responsibility, as you say, for providing protection to the average citizens in these areas of the country is unclear. And regrettably, it means that many times nobody is responsible. And of course, we haven't even talked about the tribes. What is their responsibility? What is their ability to provide security for the members of the tribes?
شبوة مجتمع قبلي، ولكن في ظل الوضع هذا يعني تكاد أن تكون القبيلة كما إذا جاز المقال يعني خلخلت صراحة، يعني خلخلوها، يعني الولاءات، طريقة الولاءات هذه تم خلخلة القبيلة بطريقة الولاءات هذه، يعني طريقة ماكرة.
The tribes in the liberated southern regions have less influence than the tribes of the north, yet they still have an essential presence in some governance, such as Shabwa. Its strength relies on its members' interconnectedness, traditions, the influence of its leaderships, and light armament. Still, all these strengths have been weakened for decades without being filled with a vital state. From the viewpoint of the American Colonel David DeRoche, who held several positions in the U.S. government, including the official in charge of defense policies for the Gulf states and Yemen, the tribes in Yemen in general played an important role to compensate for the weakness of the state. But this role appears to be fraught with dangers when loyalties are contradicted.
We also were aware that, as with any ruler in Yemen's history, nobody has absolute control over the entire country. And, the farther you get away from the port, the less far the rule of the government goes, the more you have to start talking about tribes and, friends and affiliates. And you also know that there are some Yemeni tribes where one of the sons works, with Ali Abdullah Saleh, and one works with Ali Mohsen, and one probably worked with Anwar el-Awlaki. The idea is that no matter who comes out on top, the tribe will always survive.
The affected social fabric of the tribe is not only an issue affecting stability and security. The people believe that preventing the carrying of weapons in Shabwa, for example, has become more of a problem than a solution. Weapons were banned when the Shabwani Elite Forces were present, which pledged to protect the citizens. The ban continued after the elite left, but the local authorities did not protect the citizens in return.
فعلا بعضهم يعني خلاص ما يقدر، يعني القبيلة خلاص أصبح ما تقدر القبيلة تقوم يعني تتحرك، يقول لك رجع تتحرك أبدا، إحنا يعني مسؤولين على هذا الأمر، وهم يتركون الأمر. يعني لو جيت مثلا معروف إن القبيلي إذا حصل عندنا أصحاب شبوة، إذا حصل أمر ولا تخرج بسلاحك، طيب ما بيسمح لك تمر بسلاحك أبدا، ما بيسمح لك. فهنا أنت تلتزم بعدم حمل السلاح، والجماعات الإرهابية يعني تترك.
شبوة مسالمة في طبيعتها، شبوة يحبون الأمان، يحبون الاستقرار. يعني لما جاءت النخبة الشبوانية وأمرت هذا ما عاد حمل البندق من نفسه. نحن من يا أخي تحمل نفسك بالله عليك، تمام؟ سلاح ورصاص تحملها على كتفك كذا، تمام، وأنت في أمان ومؤمن من جهة أخرى. لكن هذا ما وجدوه شيء. يا أخي لما تتكي أنت وغريمك، أنت ما تحمل السلاح وهو ما يحمل السلاح على مشكلة معينة، يعني حد يقتل مننا من الطرفين، ما حد يقتل. لكن عندما تكون أنت متسلح وأنا متسلح، هنا الجريمة جاءت. نحن لا نقبل بالسلاح يا أخي، ولا نرفض التسليح بهذا الشكل يعني. والقبائل يعني تريد تتخلص من هذا الظاهرة، تريد من يقوم في محلها يعني بتوفير الأمن لنفسها.
Citizens believe that one of the main reasons for insecurity and exposure to danger is the local authorities' concealment or even their collaboration with terrorists and criminal groups, a belief firmly established since before the regime's fall. Whether they used unknown militants to suppress demonstrations or when they were involved in carrying out or facilitating terrorist operations.
the main U.S. interest is the war against Al Qaeda. We knew, most people in the U.S. government knew that Ali Abdullah Saleh was not a man to be trusted wholeheartedly, that he was a man to be watched very closely. We also knew that he was more than capable of accepting the privileges that came with being a security partner in the United States, and at the same time keeping alive the Al Qaeda insurgency. You know, if in 2011 or 2008, Ali Abdullah Saleh had succeeded in completely wiping out Al Qaeda in Yemen, then what would the United States have to say to them? What would we have to say to them? What we'd say to them is, your human rights situation is poor. You need to hold elections. You need to broaden participation. You know, this is not a monarchy. You know, things that he didn't want to hear. So we knew that he had an interest in keeping Al Qaeda alive.
الحكومة اليمنية وحاولت تبيضها في الجنوب من أجل أن تروج للعالم الدولي أنه القاعدة والإرهاب هما مستوطنين في الجنوب، ويحشد بالدعم الخارجي الغربي والشرقي والخليجي من أجل مكافحة الإرهاب. وهذه الأموال اللي يستلمها والأسلحة هو يزود بها مؤسسات عسكرية وحرسها الجمهوري وميليشياته من الأمن القومي والمؤسسات الأخرى الأمنية الأخرى القمعية، في سبيل أن يعطي جزء من ميزانية الدولة لهذه الجماعات الإرهابية التي تعتبر هي الوجه الآخر للحكومة اليمنية، واللي شرعنت الحكومة اليمنية في الجنوب واستمراريتها هي الجماعات الإرهابية المسماة بالقاعدة التي يصرف عليها ويأتي بها من مناطق محددة ومعينة، وهذا أمر لن ينطلي على كل جنوبي.
So when I said he was an unreliable partner, what I meant was, you know, he you know, if you had, you know, a well-defined set of expectations, and you know, and you understood your limitations, you know, you could get him to do things that you wanted him to do, and he would do them. But you just had to understand that he was untrustworthy and unreliable. So you couldn't just write him a blank check and say, right, here's, you know, we're going to give you the stuff, here's what you're going to do. So, you know, the weapons we provided for use against Al Qaeda, until we left, you know, we inspected those every week. You know, we had a close degree of supervision. There wasn't a blank check, and there wasn't a lot of trust. We knew there were limits to what he could do, and there were issues. You know, the escape of the USS Cole bombers from prison in Aden, you know, that clearly happened with the connivance of people in Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is what most concerns the United States about Yemen. While Washington's fear is understandable given the threats that the organization represents to its interests, the former U.S. ambassador to Yemen also confirms that its presence constitutes a potential threat to the population.
I think that, and again, if you go back to the period of time when I was in Sana'a, which is 2010 to 2013, what was Al Qaeda doing? They tried, but failed to attack American airplanes, U.S. aviation, but they were not successful. But where were they successful? They were successful in attacking Yemenis. They were successful in attacking Yemeni security forces. They were successful in attacking Yemeni citizens. I went to Abyan in 2012 after Abyan had been liberated from Al Qaeda, after the people in Jar rose up and Zanzibar rose up against Al Qaeda. But the destruction that Al Qaeda had brought to the people of Abyan was huge. They destroyed the power plant in Jar. They mined people's homes. They booby-trapped people's homes in Zanzibar. And so Al Qaeda was a bigger threat against the people of Yemen than it was against anybody else in the world.
The Hadrami elite, Shabwani elite, and security belt forces succeeded in expelling terrorist elements from several south areas, such as Aden, Mukalla, and Shabwa. areas in Mukalla and Hadramut, where the troops are still present, are witnessing a significant security level.
I think that progress has been made, and you probably know better than I do about the situation in Mukalla. Whether I know that Al-Qaeda was there and they were trying to establish themselves, but now they've been pushed out. And so I think that it's important for the forces that push them out to continue to work with the people in Hadramaut to ensure that Al-Qaeda can't come back.
On the security and military side, the elite and belt forces have succeeded in expelling the terrorist elements and the Houthi rebels from the southern Yemen and imposing security and stability. These successes were driven by popular support and confidence in local influencers' ability to protect local communities. Since before the Yemeni crisis, such trust has been missing in government security and military services throughout the country. In 2013, a report published by the American Institute of Peace stated that security in major Yemeni cities relied heavily on the presence of the military, especially the Republican Guard and Special Forces, as well as nearly independent militias such as the Tribal Forces, the 1st Armored Division under the command of Ali Mohsen, and other special armies. The same report indicated that the Yemeni security and military forces are actively involved in criminal activity. In 2015, a report by the American Wilson Center indicated that the corrupt security system has caused tension and division in the Yemeni army, creating obstacles to build a cohesive national army capable of providing adequate security. And because most security leaders have strong ties to decision makers, according to the report, they can use these ties to increase their budgets or engage other conflicts if that serves their interests. All these facts bring us to a frightening conclusion. The state has miserably failed in its ability to protect citizens, and that it has resorted to illegal armed groups to compensate for its weakness or shirk its responsibility. It also tore apart the social fabric to achieve its interests. All this has made the right to life underestimated, the right to object suppressed, and impunity as a general rule, where the multitude of crimes guarantees immunity when states decline, as the philosopher Rousseau says.
And now for the discussion, we have live Ms. Maria Mikhail from MAIT organization. She is human rights and lawyer. Maria, welcome.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today and to represent MAIT for Peace, Development and Human Rights. Welcome everyone on this very important side event. I welcome the speakers, Mr. Nasser Awaid and Mr. Saleh Al-Noud. And of course, I welcome the Southern Independent Group and all the participants. MAIT wants to express its gratitude with this side event, as Yemen has long been suffering from lethal force. Since the start of this conflict, many Yemenis have been affected in severe way, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and all those suffering in vulnerable situations. There are thousands of victims of this armed conflict. Lethal force is used against peaceful civilians since the start of the conflict. All kinds of weapons were used against civilians. The documentary that was presented today showed us what are the South facing since 2009 and how lethal force were used against them. We are looking forward to interaction from all participants, journalists, non-governmental organizations, and others. Finally, I want to stress that MAAT will always be supportive of Yemen and its people through MAAT international and regional representation in international organizations as UN and other international organizations to keep supporting the Yemeni case and the Yemeni suffering. Thank you.
Now we have Mr. Saleh Al-Noud. Saleh Al-Noud, a long absence of the state and violations undermining the futures. What's about the Shabwa situation now?
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. I think it's only fair that I begin by highlighting some of the reasons why the human rights situation in Yemen generally, but also in particular in the south, is where it is today. I think it's widely accepted that mistakes have been made, which has allowed the human rights situation to develop and to deteriorate to the level that it is. One can put serious question marks as to why, for example, the southern areas have been ignored for the last 7 years to the extent that the suffering has reached the level that it is today. And who would be responsible for allowing the situation to develop? I think you have to highlight the role of the coalition in possibly failing to recognize the intricacies in the south, and they have made mistakes in giving the Hadi government too much power to operate to the extent that they have particularly targeted southern areas deliberately to allow the situation in the south to continue to be difficult for political reasons. As far as the situation at the moment, the film comes at a very important time, because in the last couple of days there have been significant developments in Shabwa involving effectively the handover of areas by the Hadi affiliated forces to Houthis. And therefore that poses again serious question marks as to where this conflict is going, and poses a real challenge for the coalition to deal with this potential risk to a further deterioration of human rights in Shabwa and the south in general. So I think it's important to follow the events and the developments over the next few weeks, because that will really present a clear picture as to where this conflict is developing and how much more suffering that there is likely to be because of the failures of the parties to address the issues.
Thank you, Saleh. Now the floor for the questions. Any questions, please? Okay. I have seen some questions from the live presentation on social media, on YouTube, also in Facebook. There are some inquiries and some questions. I will try to summarize some of them. I think one of the questions from Muhammad Mu'ti, he said that in the absence of the government and the continuing tension between the STC and Hadi international recognized legitimacy, who is responsible? So who is responsible for the national daily hardship in the liberated area?
I think that's a question that maybe I've already touched on. Clearly, the stalemate in the southern areas between the Southern Transitional Council and the Hadi government has been one of the reasons why there has been so much suffering. But the reality is that above both the STC and the Hadi government, there is the coalition who are the drivers of the agenda in Yemen generally. And therefore, one has to hold the coalition primarily responsible for the situation in the south in the absence of an effective government. And I think that was always going to be a recipe for disaster, given that the coalition have not really recognized local governance. And what should have happened, in effect, is to recognize that the government itself was weak, ineffective, and had very little legitimacy on the ground. And therefore, there should have been an alternative, and the coalition should have supported the STC and Southerners in governing southern areas, rather than try to turn the Yemen crisis into a problem between the STC and the Hadi government, and ignoring, obviously, the main enemy, the Houthis. I think one has to, first of all, put a question mark as to the coalition's role. But effectively, responsibility has to lie with the government for its failure to provide in the southern areas. As we all know, corruption has been very significant in the government, and the government itself has been fragmented to the extent where the human rights suffering in the south and the southern areas has been exasperated and developed to the stage where it is at today. So I do think there has to be a revisiting of the strategy to deal with the southern areas, and I think greater power should be given to the local people and the local governance mechanisms to provide for the services, and not to focus too much on a government that has failed miserably over the last 7 years to provide any sort of governance or effective leadership in those areas.
Perhaps one more question to you, Mr. Anoud. What is, in your view, the input and of the special envoy of the UN? What was he able to do, and how do you foresee the next steps, if there are any?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very important question, because let's say the performance or the strategy of the previous special envoy has been criticized a lot. He and his mission has made very little progress, and there has to be a different approach completely to the approach of the previous special envoy. We would recommend, we would advise the new special envoy to really try to deal with the main issues head on, as opposed to try to spend so much time trying to deal with the crisis in a piecemeal way, as the previous special envoy has done. And it has to be said that a lot of the suffering that is going on today has been because of the failures of the UN to really try to address the issues and put pressure on the various parties. So they've allowed the situation they've allowed the parties to maneuver too much, in particular the Houthis, who have really dominated the period of the Martin Griffiths era, and they've gained so much more during his particular tenure. So we're hopeful that the new special envoy can find a different approach, put humanity first and politics second, and recognize the realities on the ground, because there are certain structures that exist that can possibly assist the special envoy in making some progress, as opposed to in comparison to the previous special envoy.
Perhaps a follow-up, how are the Yemeni people represented, their rights represented at the Human Rights Council in Geneva? Do you know how the procedures are going on there, and if it has been, of what use it has been?
Well, I think all the parties would claim that they have representations, but I think one of the difficulties that we've all faced in trying to address the issues, the human rights issues in Yemen generally, not only in the south, is the fact that the human rights has been politicized so significantly, to the extent that even human rights has become a political tool, and really dragged away from the real sense of humanity, the suffering that people have been suffering. So a lot of the there's been a lot of misrepresentations at times, and the southern movement, for example, is probably the least represented, because the other parties to the conflict have far greater clout, far greater resources to represent their respective viewpoints. But I think as far as the southern issue, it is a basic issue. It's an issue of liberty, and it goes back well before the current crisis, because it dates back to 1990 when the unity failed, and in 1994 when the war was waged by the North against the South. So the southern issue has been developing logically for years, to the extent that it's only now the Southerners have made real progress in terms of asserting their presence on the ground. So I think times ahead will be significant. There is going to be, by the sounds of it, particularly in light of certain changes and developments in the Shabwa region, there has to be, and I think there will be, a revisiting of the strategy by the coalition, because there is a serious risk that the Hadi-affiliated forces are handing over areas in Shabwa to the Houthis, and that clearly is unlikely to be something that will be welcomed by the coalition. So we'll wait and see what happens at that front.
Perhaps the last question on my side. What is the access of the NGOs in the southern part of Yemen, and what can they, in what way and how can they help stabilizing the situation there?
Thank you for that question. I think it's very important to note that there are structures within the southern areas. The Southern Transition Council has made its services available to NGOs in order to access southern areas, and use the southern areas as a tunnel towards northern areas even. There are security measures in place which the STC have offered the international community and NGOs in order to ensure that their personnel and also their services are protected. But sadly, that has been undermined by government interference, because any move towards recognizing STC structures and a relationship with NGOs is perceived by the government to be counterproductive and less beneficial to its stature, and gives the STC greater clout and greater presence, which again, when you're considering that we are here dealing with human rights and the suffering, to have politics get in the way of humanity and providing for humans, I think that's very irresponsible, to say the least, from the government side. But yes, the STC have made it clear and continue to offer their services and the structures that they have in place for NGOs to access the south and even northern areas through the south as well.
Thank you. Do you have any further interventions?
I received one question. Maybe it's important, also, because we have seen this many times. Situation in Yemen at all. The question is in Arabic.
In the mic, please.
The question is in Arabic. I will try to translate it. The parties blame each other for the.
In the mic.
Okay. The parties blame each other for the violations, while less evidence shows that all the parties are responsible for the human rights violations. Has human rights become less important than making gains in the war, regardless of the suffering it is causing?
I think all the parties will argue that they are not responsible for any violations against human rights. But the reality is, in any conflict, that there is, relatively speaking, going to be violations by all parties. But I think it's important to put that in context and not to paint all the parties with the same brush, and we must identify the parties that are more to blame for human rights and not to simply blanket blame everybody. I think one has to say, one has to accept that the Houthi militias are probably perpetrating the worst violations, and unfortunately that is taking place under disguise, because in the north there is no media coverage, and a lot of the violations go unnoticed, unfortunately. But what has been seen in terms of the Houthis and their violations is evident in the areas where they have been visible. They have systematically killed, detained, and destroyed properties and homes of those who are in opposition, and you can imagine the suffering that follows from such practices. The Hadi government in the Shabwa region, and I think the film today represented a clear example of how the forces affiliated to the government are active in violations. Their close collaboration with extremist groups in the Shabwa region is significantly worrying. It's a serious concern because southern forces, including the Shabwani Elite Forces, have made significant progress in the war against terror. And since they've been ousted from Shabwa, there has been a re-emergence of terrorist groups, and they are highly and very active in those areas. People from or soldiers from the Shabwa Elite have been specifically targeted and killed. In terms of the south and the areas controlled by the STC, the most noticeable hardship in terms of human rights violations is simply the fact that there is very little by way of services. You know, people are really suffering, and it's a collective punishment. Now, some people might blame the STC for that as being the de facto control of those areas, but the reality is the STC does not have the resources to provide for those services, and it remains the responsibility of the government. But of course, above that, the coalition, who it has to be said, have failed miserably to provide for the most basic services in the city of Aden, for example, including the provision of electricity, which is significant given the climate and the need of such a large city with such a large population for electricity. So I think blame can be laid at different levels, but most significantly, I think the coalition ultimately, given that it is the driver of everything in Yemen, has to be held responsible primarily, and then followed by the coalition government in the southern areas. But of course, as far as the north, the Houthi militias remain the significant player in violations of human rights.
Okay, perhaps before we wrap up, can you tell us from where could or should the solution come in Yemen? I know, very difficult question for sure, but
that is the $60 million question. I think the starting point has to be the recognition of the issues, the root causes of the problems. As far as the south, southerners have demanded that they have recognition of their cause, and for that to be recognized in the political process that the UN is currently pursuing. And if that takes place, I think the prospect for peace is credible. But I think if there is to be a continuation to ignore the southern issue, the likelihood of a sustainable peace will certainly be far. And I have to say that had the southern issue been addressed 10 years ago when Ali Saleh was in power, then certainly we would not be where we are today. And certainly the humanitarian suffering that we are experiencing today would not be happening. And therefore mistakes can be costly. And I hope that there aren't any more mistakes that can be even more costly in the future.
Thank you very much. I think if there are no questions on Zoom, are there questions on Zoom? No questions on Zoom. So I think we are going to wrap it up. One question, sir. Wait, we give you the mic. One microphone, please.
Sorry, that's better for me to speak in Arabic, because the question it is direct for our صالح النود. الانتهاكات الفظيعة التي حصلت في شبوة والتي ذكرتوها حقيقة يعني يندى لها الجبين، من حيث أنه الممارسات والانتهاكات المرتكبة بحق أبناء الجنوب في شبوة انتهاكات تصل إلى توصيفها إلى جرائم ضد الإنسانية من ناحية، وأيضا جرائم حرب. هنا السؤال يبرز أنه طالما في هذه الدورة المجلس حقوق الإنسان هناك في تقرير متكامل حول الانتهاكات في اليمن، لماذا التقرير فريق الخبراء لم يشر إلى هذه الانتهاكات ولم يتطرق إليها برغم حجمها ومعرفتها وفظاعتها. هل هو موقف سياسي من هذا الفريق أم هو فقط موقف مهني عدم اكتراث بهذه الانتهاكات؟ شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا.
Can you please answer in English and just tell in a few words what was the question?
Of course, the question is, there clearly are serious violations in Shabwa, and the recent UN experts report have not really addressed the issue to the length that it deserves, in the details that it deserves. And the question is, does politics play a role in what is categorized as human rights violations or not? Effectively, I think you are absolutely right to raise the point of politics and how politics interferes in human rights. There is no doubt the serious violations are taking place in Shabwa and other parts of the south. But I think the legitimate government was, in my opinion, does not really have any legitimacy, but it's managed to hold on to the title of legitimacy, and it's recognized internationally, in international law. And that, to me, has been one of the real reasons, one of the most important reasons why this government has been allowed to continue to exist, whilst it is one of the reasons that human rights violations are taking place. And I think I have to say that international experts or people following the issue in Yemen generally tend to have a little bit of a bias. The default position is we have a legitimate government and everybody else is less important in terms of legitimacy. I think that has to change. You know, there needs to be a re-evaluation of the situation in Yemen generally. The legitimate government, or the so-called legitimate government, is only one party to a conflict, and legitimacy is no longer by the fact that this was a government before the war. At the moment, it is simply a party to the war, and you might argue that the STC in the south has greater legitimacy than the legitimate government, and therefore I do call on the international observers to address the issues as they are on the ground and not to be biased by politics or by the status of the parties, because at the moment, if you really look closely, a lot of the problems in terms of corruption, in terms of the handing over of areas in the south to the Houthis, the government does not really have any legitimacy, and in fact is probably being counter-legitimate. It is destroying everything that is legitimate in Yemen, and therefore you have to look at the parties, other parties, and put some legitimacy to each party. And I think the STC in the south is primarily the legitimate body as we speak, with some progress towards a unified southern body that takes account of all the voices. And I know that the STC are currently in the process of peace talks, or if you like, dialogue with other southern groups in order to ensure that the southerners have a voice that is collective and represents all the people in the south. In brief, therefore, I do think that politics plays a part, and I think the legitimacy title that the government has had for the last number of years has been counterproductive and used to its advantage, but against the people, and made it very difficult for the issues to be addressed by the international community and to understand what the issues are in Yemen generally.
Thank you very much. So are there still another question? No question? Okay. So I really want to thank Mr. Nassar Obaid, human rights activist for the Southern Independent Group, as well as Saleh Al-Noud, who is a lawyer specialized in human rights law and practicing in Sheffield, United Kingdom. Thank you, sirs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for following this session. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.